Rebecca Walsh had everything going for her. At 34 years old, she lived in a beautiful house on Maple Street in Millfield, Ohio. The house was painted white with blue shutters and had a perfectly green lawn that made all the neighbors jealous. Rebecca worked hard to keep everything looking perfect, just like her life seemed to be. Every morning, Rebecca would wake up at 6:30 and make herself a cup of coffee in her spotless kitchen. She would sit at her small breakfast table and look out the window at her garden while planning her day. Rebecca owned a marketing company that helped small businesses grow bigger. She was really good at her job and made enough money to buy nice things like her red BMW and designer clothes. People in the neighborhood loved Rebecca. She was always friendly and would wave to everyone when she walked her small dog Max around the block. Rebecca had long brown hair that she kept neat and always wore lipstick, even when she was just going to the grocery store. She smiled a lot and had a laugh that made other people want to laugh too. Rebecca was not just successful at work, she was also planning the wedding of her dreams. Her boyfriend, David Miller, had asked her to marry him 6 months ago, and Rebecca could not stop talking about the wedding plans. She showed everyone the diamond ring David had given her. It was not the biggest ring anyone had ever seen, but Rebecca loved it because David had picked it out just for her. David worked as a teacher at the local high school. He taught history and coached the baseball team. All the students liked him because he was patient and funny. David was 31 years old with short blonde hair and kind eyes. He and Rebecca met 3 years ago at a coffee shop downtown. Rebecca always said it was love at first sight, but David liked to joke that he fell in love with her laugh before he even saw her face. The couple had already picked out a venue for their wedding. They wanted to get married at the old church on Main Street where Rebecca's parents had gotten married 30 years ago. Rebecca spent her free time looking at wedding dresses online and making lists of everything she needed to do before the big day. She had already chosen her sister Emma to be her maid of honor. Emma Walsh was 2 years younger than Rebecca and worked as a nurse at the local hospital. The sisters were very close and talked on the phone almost every day. They had dinner together every Thursday night at Rebecca's house. Emma would bring takeout food and Rebecca would make dessert. They would sit in Rebecca's living room and watch movies while they ate and talked about their week. Rebecca's house was her pride and joy. She had bought it 5 years ago and spent a lot of time and money making it look exactly how she wanted. The living room had cream-colored walls and a big comfortable couch facing a fireplace. Rebecca had put family photos on the mantel and always kept fresh flowers on the coffee table. The coffee table was made of dark wood and had a thick glass top that Rebecca polished until it sparkled. One of Rebecca's favorite things in her house was a heavy glass sculpture that sat on the coffee table. It was shaped like a wave and caught the light from the window in a beautiful way. Rebecca had bought it at an art fair 2 summers ago and always told visitors the story of how she found it. She said the artist who made it told her it represented new beginnings, which seemed perfect for someone starting a new business and planning a wedding. Rebecca was known for throwing great dinner parties. She would invite friends over on Saturday nights and cook elaborate meals. She loved trying new recipes and was especially good at making pasta dishes and chocolate cake. Her friends always said they looked forward to Rebecca's parties because she made everyone feel welcome, and the food was always delicious. On March 15, 2019, Rebecca had a normal day at work. She met with 3 different clients and worked on a big advertising campaign for a local restaurant. Her assistant said Rebecca seemed happy and excited because she had an appointment the next day to try on wedding dresses. Rebecca left work at 5:30 just like she always did. Rebecca stopped at the grocery store on her way home to buy ingredients for dinner. She was planning to make chicken and vegetables because Emma was coming over. The grocery store clerk remembered Rebecca because she was always polite and asked about his family. Rebecca bought chicken, broccoli, rice, and a bottle of white wine. She also picked up dog treats for Max. When Rebecca got home, she parked her red BMW in the driveway and carried her groceries inside. She fed Max and let him out in the backyard to play. Then she started cooking dinner and opened the bottle of wine. Rebecca put on some music and danced around the kitchen while she cooked, something she did whenever she was in a really good mood. At 7 o'clock, Emma arrived at Rebecca's house for their weekly dinner. But when she got there, something was wrong. The front door was wide open, which was very strange because Rebecca always kept her doors locked. Emma called out for Rebecca but got no answer. She walked into the house slowly, feeling scared. Emma found Rebecca's purse sitting on the kitchen counter with her wallet and keys still inside. The dinner Rebecca had been cooking was still on the stove, but it was burned because no one had turned off the heat. Max was barking loudly in the backyard, which he never did unless something was wrong. Emma walked into the living room and saw that the coffee table had been knocked over. The beautiful glass sculpture that Rebecca loved so much was missing from its usual spot. There were dark spots on the wooden floor that looked like they might be blood. Emma's hands were shaking as she took out her phone and called 911. The police arrived 15 minutes later. Detective Frank Rodriguez was the first officer to walk through Rebecca's house. He could tell right away that something terrible had happened. Rebecca's car was gone from the driveway. Her cell phone was nowhere to be found, and there were clear signs that someone had fought in the living room. As Emma stood in the front yard crying, she kept saying that this could not be happening. Rebecca had such a perfect life. She was successful, engaged, and happy. Who would want to hurt someone like Rebecca? The detective promised Emma they would find out what happened to her sister, but inside he was worried. In his 20 years of police work, he had seen too many cases like this one, and they did not always end well. Detective Frank Rodriguez had been solving crimes for 20 years, but he still felt his stomach drop when he walked into Rebecca Walsh's living room. The overturned coffee table, the missing glass sculpture, and the dark stains on the floor told a story he had seen too many times before. This was not a burglary gone wrong or a random break-in. This looked personal. Rodriguez was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes who had worked hundreds of missing person cases. His partner, Detective Lisa Thompson, arrived 30 minutes after him. Thompson was younger with short black hair and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She had been a detective for 8 years and was known for asking the right questions at the right time. The two detectives started by talking to Emma Walsh, who was still crying on the front porch. Emma told them everything she could remember about her sister's life. Rebecca was happy, successful, and engaged to a good man. She had no enemies that Emma knew about. Rebecca never carried much cash, and her jewelry was not expensive enough to kill someone over. But as Emma talked more, she remembered something that made Detective Thompson write quickly in her notebook. About 2 months ago, Rebecca had mentioned a client who was making her uncomfortable. Emma could not remember his name, but she said Rebecca had told her the man kept asking her out, even though she was engaged. Rebecca had said the man would not take no for an answer. The next morning, Rodriguez and Thompson went to Rebecca's office building downtown. The building was old and had small offices for different businesses. Rebecca's company was on the 3rd floor in a space with 2 rooms. One room had her desk and computer. The other room had a small table where she met with clients. Rebecca's assistant was a young woman named Kelly Johnson. Kelly had worked for Rebecca for 2 years and knew everything about the business. She was crying when the detectives arrived and kept saying she could not believe someone would hurt Rebecca. Kelly said Rebecca was the nicest boss she had ever had and always remembered Kelly's birthday and brought her soup when she was sick. Kelly told the detectives about all of Rebecca's recent clients. Most of them were small business owners who wanted help with advertising. There was the man who owned a pizza restaurant, the woman who sold handmade jewelry, and the couple who had started a lawn care service. All of these clients seemed normal and happy with Rebecca's work. But then Kelly's face changed when she talked about Jake Patterson. Jake was 28 years old and owned a small construction company. He had hired Rebecca 3 months ago to help him get more customers. At first, everything seemed fine. Jake paid his bills on time and seemed pleased with the marketing materials Rebecca created for him. The problem started about 6 weeks ago. Jake began showing up at the office without appointments. He would bring Rebecca coffee and flowers, even though Kelly always told him Rebecca was engaged. Jake would sit in the waiting area for hours, hoping Rebecca would have time to see him. When Rebecca finally talked to him, Jake would try to turn business meetings into personal conversations. Kelly said Rebecca had become uncomfortable with Jake's behavior. He would call the office several times a day, sometimes just to hear Rebecca's voice. He asked Rebecca personal questions about her wedding plans and her relationship with David. When Rebecca tried to keep things professional, Jake would get angry and say she was being cold to him. The situation got worse 2 weeks before. Rebecca disappeared. Jake had shown up at her office on a Friday afternoon when Kelly had already gone home. Rebecca was alone and working late on a project. Jake knocked on the door and Rebecca let him in, thinking he needed to discuss business. Instead, Jake told Rebecca he was in love with her. He said she should break up with David and give him a chance. Rebecca told Jake she was happy with David and asked him to leave. Jake got angry and started yelling. He said David was not good enough for her and that she was making a mistake. Rebecca managed to get Jake to leave that night, but she was shaken by what happened. She told Kelly about it the next Monday and said she was thinking about ending her business relationship with Jake. Rebecca was worried that Jake might cause trouble, but she hoped he would just go away if she stopped working with him. Kelly also told the detectives something that made them very interested in Jake Patterson. The week before Rebecca disappeared, Jake had called the office and asked Kelly what time Rebecca usually went home from work. Kelly thought it was a strange question and did not answer it. She told Rebecca about the call, and Rebecca looked scared when she heard about it. Detective Thompson asked Kelly if she knew where they could find Jake. Kelly gave them his business address and phone number. She also told them that Jake drove a white pickup truck with his company name painted on the side. The detectives thanked Kelly and promised to keep her updated on the investigation. Rodriguez and Thompson drove to Jake's construction company, which was located in an industrial area on the other side of town. The building was small and needed paint. There were tools and construction materials scattered around the parking lot, but when they knocked on the door, no one answered. A man working at the business next door saw the detectives and walked over to talk to them. He said Jake had left town suddenly 3 days ago. Jake had told his employees he had a family emergency and needed to leave right away. He said he would be back in a few weeks, but the neighbor thought it was strange because Jake had never mentioned having family problems before. The neighbor also said something that made the detectives very suspicious. He had seen Jake loading boxes into his pickup truck late at night on March 15th, the same day Rebecca disappeared. Jake looked nervous and kept looking around, as if he was worried someone might see him. Rodriguez and Thompson went to Jake's apartment building. The landlord let them look inside Jake's apartment, and what they found confirmed their suspicions. The apartment was completely empty. All of Jake's clothes, furniture, and personal items were gone. It looked like he had moved out in a hurry. The landlord said Jake had paid his rent through the end of the month but had not said anything about moving out. Jake had lived there for 3 years and had never caused any problems before. The landlord was confused about why Jake would leave so suddenly without saying goodbye. Detective Thompson found something interesting in the bathroom trash can. There was a cell phone that had been smashed with a hammer. The phone was damaged too badly to get any information from it, but it showed that Jake was trying to destroy evidence before he left town. By the end of their second day investigating, Rodriguez and Thompson knew they had found their main suspect. Jake Patterson had motive, opportunity, and had run away right after Rebecca disappeared. They put out a warrant for his arrest and started working with police departments in other states to try to find him. But Jake Patterson had disappeared completely, and the detectives worried that he might never be found. 3 weeks passed since Rebecca Walsh disappeared, and Detective Rodriguez was getting frustrated. Every lead about Jake Patterson had gone nowhere. The police had checked with his family in other states, but no one had seen him. His bank account had not been touched since the day he left town. His credit cards were not being used anywhere. Jake Patterson had vanished like smoke. The whole town of Millfield was scared. People started locking their doors during the day and looking over their shoulders when they walked alone. Rebecca's disappearance was front-page news in the local newspaper every day. Her picture was posted on telephone poles and in store windows all over town. David Miller, Rebecca's fiancé, was having a hard time dealing with what happened. He had taken time off from teaching because he could not concentrate on his students. David spent most of his time helping with search parties or sitting at home staring at pictures of Rebecca. His friends worried about him because he was not eating or sleeping much. Emma Walsh was also struggling. She blamed herself for not arriving at Rebecca's house earlier that night. Maybe if she had gotten there at 6:30 instead of 7 o'clock, she could have prevented whatever happened to her sister. Emma took leave from her job at the hospital and spent every day either searching for Rebecca or sitting by the phone waiting for news. On April 5th, a Saturday morning, two college students named Mike Chen and Jennifer Lopez decided to go hiking in Blackwood State Forest. The forest was about 30 miles from Millfield and was popular with people who liked to walk on nature trails. Mike and Jennifer were both 20 years old and studied at the community college. They often went hiking together on weekends to get away from their studies. The weather that morning was perfect for hiking. The sun was shining and there was a cool breeze blowing through the trees. Mike and Jennifer parked their car at the main entrance to the forest and started walking on the Blue Trail, which was supposed to be an easy 3-mile hike. About 2 miles into their hike, Jennifer noticed a bad smell coming from somewhere off the trail. At first, they thought it might be a dead animal. Wild animals sometimes died in the forest and their bodies would smell terrible as they rotted. But the smell was so strong that Mike suggested they investigate to make sure it was not something more serious. They walked about 50 feet into the woods, following their noses toward the source of the smell. What they found changed everything. There was a spot where the ground looked different from the rest of the forest floor. The dirt had been dug up and then covered over again, but not very well. Whoever had dug the hole had tried to cover it with leaves and branches, but some of the dirt was still visible. Jennifer saw something that made her scream. There was a human hand sticking up through the loose dirt. Mike immediately called 911 on his cell phone while Jennifer sat on a fallen log and cried. Within 20 minutes, the forest was full of police cars, ambulances, and crime scene investigators. Detective Rodriguez arrived at the scene 40 minutes after Mike's phone call. He had been hoping they would find Rebecca alive, but deep down, he knew this day would probably come. When someone disappeared the way Rebecca had with signs of violence in their home, they were usually found dead. The crime scene team worked very carefully to uncover the body. They took pictures of everything before they moved anything. They collected soil samples and looked for any evidence that might help solve the case. The work was slow and difficult because they did not want to miss anything important. It took 4 hours to completely uncover Rebecca's body. She was wearing the same clothes she had on the day she disappeared. Her engagement ring was still on her finger, which meant this was not a robbery. The medical examiner said she had been killed by someone hitting her in the head with a heavy object. The injury matched the size and shape of the missing glass sculpture from Rebecca's coffee table. Detective Thompson found tire tracks near the burial site. The tracks were made by a large vehicle, probably a pickup truck. They took photographs and made plaster casts of the tracks so they could compare them to any vehicles they might find later. There was also a cigarette butt about 10 feet from the grave that might have DNA evidence on it. The hardest part of Rodriguez's job was calling Rebecca's family to tell them the news. He drove to Emma's house and knocked on her door. When Emma saw his face, she knew what he was going to tell her before he said a word. Emma collapsed on her couch and cried for an hour, while Rodriguez sat with her and waited for other family members to arrive. David Miller was at Rebecca's house when Rodriguez called him. David had been going there every day to water her plants and take care of Max, her dog. When he heard that Rebecca was dead, David threw his phone across the room and punched a hole in the wall. His friends came over immediately to make sure he did not hurt himself. The news that Rebecca's body had been found spread through Millfield within hours. People were sad, but also relieved to finally know what had happened to her. At least now, her family could plan a funeral and try to start healing. But everyone was still scared because Jake Patterson was somewhere out there, and no one knew if he might hurt someone else. The local newspaper ran a huge story about finding Rebecca's body. Her picture was on the front page again, but this time the headline said, "Beloved businesswoman found dead." The article talked about what a good person Rebecca was and how much the community would miss her. Rebecca's funeral was held at the same church where she had planned to get married. More than 500 people came to say goodbye. The church was decorated with white flowers, Rebecca's favorite. David sat in the front row with Emma and the rest of Rebecca's family. Many people were crying, including some who had barely known Rebecca, but were touched by her story. The minister talked about how Rebecca had lived a life full of love and kindness. He said she had made the world a better place through her work and her relationships with other people. Even though her life was cut short, the minister said Rebecca's memory would live on in the hearts of everyone who knew her. After the funeral, Detective Rodriguez promised Rebecca's family that he would not give up until Jake Patterson was caught and brought to justice. But as the weeks turned into months, it seemed like Jake had disappeared forever. The case was still active, but there were no new leads and no sign of the killer anywhere. As 2019 turned into 2020, the investigation into Rebecca Walsh's murder seemed to hit a dead end. Detective Rodriguez had followed every lead and interviewed dozens of people, but Jake Patterson remained a ghost. The FBI had joined the investigation and put Jake on their most wanted list, but even they could not find any trace of him. Jake Patterson had indeed vanished, but he was not as clever as he thought he was. He was living in Portland, Oregon, under the fake name Tom Johnson. Jake had always been good with his hands, so he found work as a day laborer doing construction and repair jobs. He paid cash for everything and rented a small, dirty apartment in a bad part of town. Jake looked very different than he had in Ohio. He had grown a thick beard and dyed his brown hair black. He wore old clothes and baseball caps pulled down low over his face. Jake never talked to his co-workers about his past and always said he was from California when anyone asked. Most people left him alone because he seemed unfriendly and angry, most of the time. The apartment Jake rented was on the third floor of an old building that needed a lot of repairs. There were cockroaches in the kitchen and the heat barely worked in the winter. But Jake did not care about living in a nice place. He just wanted somewhere cheap where nobody would ask questions about who he was or where he came from. Every day, Jake worried that the police would find him. He had nightmares about being arrested and would wake up in a cold sweat. Jake knew he had made a terrible mistake when he killed Rebecca, but there was no way to take it back now. All he could do was try to stay hidden and hope that people would eventually forget about what happened. But Jake had one weakness that would eventually lead to his downfall. He could not completely cut ties with his old life. Back in Ohio, Jake had a best friend named Tommy Rogers who had known him since they were kids. Tommy and Jake had grown up on the same street and had been like brothers for over 20 years. Tommy Rogers was 30 years old and worked as a mechanic at a garage in Millfield. He was married to a woman named Lisa and had 2 young children. Tommy was a good man who worked hard and took care of his family. He had always known that Jake had problems with anger and jealousy, but Tommy never imagined his friend could hurt anyone. When Rebecca Walsh first disappeared, Tommy wondered if Jake might be involved. Jake had always gotten obsessed with women who did not want to date him. In high school, Jake had stalked a girl named Amy until her parents threatened to call the police. A few years later, Jake had followed another woman around town until she got a restraining order against him. But Tommy pushed these thoughts out of his mind because he did not want to believe his best friend was a killer. When the police came to talk to him about Jake, Tommy told them he had not heard from Jake since he left town. This was not completely true. Jake had called Tommy twice from different phone numbers, but the conversations were short, and Jake would not say where he was calling from. In Portland, Jake was becoming more and more paranoid. He changed apartments 3 times in his first year there because he was afraid his landlords were getting suspicious. Jake also changed jobs frequently because he worried that his co-workers might figure out who he really was. The worst part for Jake was the loneliness. He had no friends in Portland and was afraid to get close to anyone. Jake spent most of his free time in his apartment watching television and drinking beer. Sometimes he would walk around the city late at night when there were fewer people on the streets. Jake felt like he was living in prison even though he was technically free. Back in Millfield, Rebecca's family was trying to move on with their lives. Emma had returned to work at the hospital, but she was not the same person she used to be. She had become quiet and serious, and her co-workers noticed that she rarely smiled anymore. Emma had moved into Rebecca's house to take care of Max, Rebecca's dog. Sometimes she would sit in Rebecca's living room and talk to Max about how much she missed her sister. David Miller was having an even harder time. He had returned to teaching, but his students could tell he was still very sad. David had lost a lot of weight and looked tired all the time. His friends tried to get him to go out and meet new people, but David said he was not ready to date anyone else yet. He still wore the watch Rebecca had given him for his birthday and kept her picture on his desk at school. The police investigation was still officially open, but Detective Rodriguez had other cases to work on. Every few weeks, someone would call with a tip about seeing Jake Patterson somewhere, but none of these tips led to anything. Rodriguez was starting to worry that Jake might never be caught. In the summer of 2020, something happened that gave Jake a false sense of security. The COVID pandemic had changed everything, and people were not paying as much attention to old news stories. Jake noticed that there were fewer stories about Rebecca's murder in the newspapers and on television. He started to think that maybe people were forgetting about what had happened. This was a big mistake. Detective Rodriguez had not forgotten about Rebecca Walsh, and neither had her family. Every month, Emma would call Rodriguez to check if there were any new developments in the case. David would sometimes stop by the police station to ask the same question. These visits reminded Rodriguez that people were still waiting for justice. Jake's other big mistake was staying in contact with Tommy Rogers. Every few months, Jake would buy a cheap phone and call Tommy late at night when he was drunk and feeling sorry for himself. Jake would ask about news from home and whether the police were still looking for him. Tommy always said he had not heard anything new, but these conversations made him very uncomfortable. Tommy was torn between loyalty to his old friend and doing what was right. He loved Jake like a brother, but he also felt terrible about what had happened to Rebecca Walsh. Tommy had seen Rebecca around town before she was killed, and she seemed like a nice person who did not deserve what happened to her. As 2020 turned into 2021, Jake started to relax a little bit. He had been living under his fake name for almost 2 years without getting caught. Jake even started thinking about maybe moving somewhere else and starting a completely new life. But he had no idea that his next phone call to Tommy would change everything. The investigation was still ongoing, and Detective Rodriguez refused to give up hope. He knew that criminals often made mistakes when they started to feel safe. Rodriguez had seen it happen many times before. The key was to be patient and wait for the right opportunity. He had a feeling that opportunity was coming soon. February 18, 2021 was a cold, rainy night in Portland, Oregon. Jake Patterson had spent the day working at a construction site, tearing down an old warehouse. The work was hard and his back was sore, but at least it kept his mind busy. When Jake got home to his small apartment, he felt the familiar wave of loneliness and depression that hit him every evening. Jake had been drinking more lately. It started with just a few beers after work, but now he was drinking almost every night until he passed out. The alcohol helped him forget about what he had done to Rebecca Walsh, but it also made him emotional and careless. On this particular night, Jake had drunk half a bottle of whiskey and was feeling especially sorry for himself. He sat on his old couch in his dark apartment, staring at the cheap cell phone he had bought that morning. Jake had been thinking about calling Tommy Rogers for weeks, but he knew it was dangerous. Every phone call was a risk that could lead the police back to him. But Jake was so lonely and scared that he did not care about being careful anymore. At 11:30 that night, Jake dialed Tommy's number. Back in Millfield, Tommy was getting ready for bed when his phone rang. Tommy saw that the call was from an unknown number, but something told him to answer it anyway. He had a feeling it might be Jake. Tommy answered the phone and heard Jake's voice, slurred from drinking too much whiskey. Jake sounded terrible, like he had been crying. Tommy immediately knew that his old friend was in bad shape. Jake said he needed to talk to someone, or he was going to lose his mind. Tommy sat down on his bed and prepared for what might be a long conversation. For the first few minutes, Jake just rambled about how hard his life had become. He complained about his job, his apartment, and how lonely he felt. Tommy listened patiently, like he always had when they were kids and Jake was upset about something. But then the conversation took a dark turn that changed everything. Jake started talking about Rebecca Walsh. He said her name for the first time since he had left Ohio, and Tommy's blood went cold. Jake said he could not stop thinking about Rebecca and what had happened that night at her house. He said he had nightmares about her every single night and could not make them stop. Tommy's hands started shaking as he realized what Jake was about to tell him. Tommy quickly looked around his bedroom to make sure his wife Lisa was still asleep. She was sleeping peacefully next to him, having no idea that her husband was about to hear a confession to murder. Jake's voice got quieter as he started to tell Tommy what really happened on March 15, 2019. Jake said he had driven to Rebecca's house that evening because he could not accept that she did not want to be with him. He had been drinking before he went there, which made him even more emotional than usual. When Jake knocked on Rebecca's door, she let him in because she thought he was there on business. Rebecca was cooking dinner and seemed happy until she realized Jake was drunk. She asked him to leave, but Jake refused. He said he needed to tell her how he felt about her one more time. Jake told Tommy that he had begged Rebecca to break up with David and give him a chance. He said Rebecca was making a mistake by marrying David because David did not love her as much as he did. But Rebecca got angry and told Jake that she never wanted to see him again. She said she was going to call the police if he did not leave her house immediately. This was when Jake lost control. He said Rebecca's rejection made him so angry that he could not think straight. When Rebecca reached for her phone to call 911, Jake grabbed the heavy glass sculpture from her coffee table. He said he did not mean to hurt her, but he was so mad that he could not stop himself. Jake described how he had hit Rebecca in the head with the sculpture. She fell to the floor and did not move. Jake said he knelt down next to her and tried to wake her up, but it was too late. Rebecca was dead, and Jake knew his life was over too. Tommy was crying as he listened to his friend describe what he had done to an innocent woman. Tommy had known Jake for most of his life, but he felt like he was talking to a stranger. The Jake he grew up with had problems, but he was not a killer. At least Tommy had never thought he was. Jake continued his confession, telling Tommy how he had panicked after realizing Rebecca was dead. He said he put Rebecca's body in her car and drove to Blackwood State Forest, a place they had gone camping when they were teenagers. Jake dug a shallow grave with a shovel he found in Rebecca's garage and buried her there. After burying Rebecca, Jake drove her car to a shopping mall and left it in the parking lot. He walked to a truck stop and convinced a driver to give him a ride back to Millfield. Jake went straight to his apartment and packed everything he owned. He was on a bus to Portland by the next morning. Tommy listened to all of this in horrified silence. When Jake finished talking, there was a long pause on the phone. Finally, Tommy asked Jake why he was telling him all of this. Jake said he was thinking about turning himself in because he could not live with the guilt anymore. He said he was tired of running and hiding and just wanted the nightmare to end. But then Jake changed his mind. He said he was too scared to go to prison and asked Tommy to promise never to tell anyone what he had just heard. Jake said Tommy was the only person in the world he trusted, and he needed to know that his secret was safe. Tommy did not know what to say. Part of him still loved Jake like a brother and wanted to protect him. But another part of him was disgusted by what Jake had done to Rebecca Walsh. Tommy thought about Rebecca's family and how they deserved to know the truth about what happened to their daughter and sister. The phone call lasted for over an hour. By the time it ended, both men were emotionally drained. Jake made Tommy promise again that he would never tell anyone about their conversation. Tommy said he promised, but inside, he was not sure if he could keep that promise. After Jake hung up the phone, he passed out on his couch with the empty whiskey bottle in his hand. He felt relieved to have finally told someone the truth about what he had done. Jake thought that sharing his secret with Tommy would make him feel better, but he was wrong. If anything, talking about the murder made Jake feel even worse. Tommy did not sleep at all that night. He lay in bed next to his wife, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything Jake had told him. Tommy kept thinking about Rebecca Walsh and how she must have been scared in her last moments. He thought about her family and friends who were still waiting for justice. By morning, Tommy knew what he had to do. He could not live with himself if he kept Jake's secret. Rebecca Walsh deserved better than that, and so did her family. Tommy made a decision that would change both his life and Jake's life forever. But first, Tommy needed to make sure he had proof of what Jake had told him. The next time Jake called, Tommy would be ready. Tommy Rogers spent 3 weeks in agony after Jake's confession call. Every morning he woke up thinking about Rebecca Walsh and her family. Every night he went to bed wondering if he was doing the right thing by keeping Jake's secret. Tommy had always been a good person who tried to help others, and staying quiet about a murder went against everything he believed in. Tommy's wife, Lisa, noticed that something was wrong with her husband. Tommy was not eating much and seemed distracted all the time. When Lisa asked him what was bothering him, Tommy said he was just worried about work. He could not tell her the truth because he knew it would put her in an impossible situation too. On March 10, 2021, almost exactly 2 years after Rebecca's murder, Jake called Tommy again. This time, Tommy was ready. He had downloaded a call recording app on his phone and had been waiting for Jake to contact him. When Tommy saw the unknown number on his phone, his heart started beating fast. Jake sounded even worse than he had during their last conversation. He had been drinking again and was crying as he talked. Jake said he could not take the guilt anymore and was thinking about killing himself. He said living with what he had done to Rebecca was worse than being dead. Tommy tried to calm Jake down while secretly recording their conversation. Tommy told Jake that suicide was not the answer and that there were other ways to deal with his problems. But Jake was too drunk and emotional to listen to reason. Then Jake started talking about Rebecca Walsh again. This time, he gave Tommy even more details about what had happened that night. Jake said he remembered exactly what Rebecca was wearing when he killed her. He described the smell of the dinner she had been cooking and how her dog Max had been barking in the backyard. Jake also told Tommy something the police had never released to the public. He said that after he hit Rebecca with the glass sculpture, he had tried to clean up the blood with paper towels from her kitchen. Jake said he threw the bloody paper towels in a dumpster behind a gas station on his way out of town. Tommy knew these details proved that Jake was really the killer. Only someone who had been there that night would know such specific information. Tommy felt sick as he listened to his childhood friend describe murdering an innocent woman, but he forced himself to keep recording. Near the end of the call, Jake asked Tommy again to promise that he would never tell anyone what he had heard. Jake said Tommy was the only family he had left, and begged him not to turn him in. Tommy said he promised, but this time he was lying. Tommy had already made up his mind about what he was going to do. After Jake hung up, Tommy sat in his car in the parking lot of a grocery store and listened to the recording he had just made. Hearing Jake confess to murder a second time made Tommy feel like he was going to throw up, but he knew he had the evidence he needed to give Rebecca's family the justice they deserved. The next morning, Tommy called the Millfield Police Department and asked to speak with Detective Rodriguez. When Rodriguez got on the phone, Tommy said he had information about the Rebecca Walsh murder case. Rodriguez had received hundreds of tips over the past 2 years, but something in Tommy's voice made him pay attention. Tommy went to the police station that afternoon and met with Rodriguez and Detective Thompson. Tommy was so nervous that his hands were shaking as he explained who he was and how he knew Jake Patterson. The detectives could tell that Tommy was scared, but they could also tell he was telling the truth. When Tommy played the recording of Jake's confession, both detectives got very excited. They had been waiting for a break in the case for almost 2 years, and now they finally had one. The recording contained details about the crime that only the killer would know, which meant it would hold up in court. Rodriguez immediately contacted the FBI and the Portland Police Department. Within 6 hours, they had Jake's address and were preparing to arrest him. Jake had no idea that his best friend had betrayed him or that the police were closing in on him. The next morning, Portland police officers surrounded Jake's apartment building. They knocked on his door at 6 o'clock in the morning while Jake was still sleeping off another night of heavy drinking. When Jake opened the door and saw the police officers, he knew his 2 years of running were over. Jake did not resist arrest. He looked relieved as the officers put handcuffs on him and read him his rights. One of the officers said Jake actually smiled when they told him he was being arrested for the murder of Rebecca Walsh. It was like a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Detective Rodriguez flew to Portland that same day to question Jake and arrange for his transport back to Ohio. Jake confessed to the murder again, this time officially and on video. He said he was tired of running and hiding and was ready to face the consequences of what he had done. When the news broke that Jake Patterson had been arrested for Rebecca's murder, the entire town of Millfield celebrated. People had been waiting for this day for almost 2 years, and many of them cried tears of joy when they heard that the killer had finally been caught. Emma Walsh was at work at the hospital when Detective Rodriguez called to tell her the news. Emma started crying so hard that her supervisor sent her home for the day. Emma drove straight to the cemetery where Rebecca was buried and sat by her sister's grave for hours, telling her that her killer had finally been caught. David Miller was teaching his history class when the principal came to his classroom and asked to speak with him privately. When David heard that Jake had been arrested, he sat down in the hallway and cried. David's students could see through the classroom window that their teacher was upset, but they did not understand why he looked so happy at the same time. Jake was brought back to Ohio a week later and charged with first-degree murder. His lawyer advised him to take a plea deal because the evidence against him was overwhelming. Jake agreed to plead guilty in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing, Emma Walsh gave a victim impact statement that brought everyone in the courtroom to tears. Emma talked about how much she missed her sister and how Rebecca's death had changed her entire family. She said that while nothing could bring Rebecca back, knowing that her killer was behind bars gave them some peace. Emma also thanked Tommy Rogers for having the courage to come forward with the truth. She said she knew it must have been hard for Tommy to turn in his best friend, but his decision had given Rebecca's family the closure they desperately needed. Tommy Rogers was in the courtroom that day, sitting in the back row with tears streaming down his face. He felt guilty about betraying Jake, but he knew he had done the right thing. After the hearing, Rebecca's family came over to thank Tommy personally. Emma hugged him and told him that Rebecca would have been proud of his courage. Jake Patterson was sentenced to life in prison without parole on September 15, 2021. As the judge read his sentence, Jake looked directly at Rebecca's family and said he was sorry for what he had done. He said he knew his apology could not bring Rebecca back, but he wanted them to know that he regretted his actions every single day. Jake was sent to a maximum security prison in southern Ohio, where he will spend the rest of his life. He has not tried to appeal his sentence and has said that he deserves to be punished for what he did. Jake spends most of his time in his cell reading books and writing letters to Rebecca's family asking for forgiveness. The case officially closed on the day Jake was sentenced, but its impact on the community of Millfield will last forever. Rebecca's story became a reminder that violence can happen anywhere, and that ordinary people sometimes have to make extraordinary choices to ensure justice is served. Tommy Rogers still struggles with guilt over his decision to turn in his best friend, but he has found peace in knowing that he helped bring a killer to justice. Rebecca Walsh's memory lives on through the scholarship fund established in her name and through the lives of everyone who was touched by her story. Detective Rodriguez retired 6 months after Jake's sentencing, saying that solving Rebecca's case was the most important thing he had done in his 30-year career. He still keeps a picture of Rebecca on his desk at home as a reminder that some cases are worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes to solve them.